mental health first aid, which is becoming increasingly important through all areas of drama training, not just for when you're a sort of grown-up actor working in films, having graduated. De-rolling techniques and the ability to risk assess the impact of intimate scenes. It's a really quite complicated job. So I'm just going to very quickly flip over the page. More scribbly notes I've got to wade through. So for me, IC is completely inclusive. And more than anything else I can think of right now, it acts as a mirror to the societal change that we have undergone and are still undergoing. I've written a paper that describes this and interrogates this in a lot more detail, and that's going to be published as part of the proceedings. There's a whole suite of papers that will be due for publication later in the summer as part of the Change Now project. But because I've got, I don't know what, not even 10 minutes, I suspect, and I need to let Miriam and Molly speak, I'm just going to very quickly focus on three things. Rights and the way that we're empowering future generations of actors by embedding this work in drama school learning. Resistance, I want to talk very briefly about why we're still getting resistance in the industry, and more importantly, the resistance of IC itself to the perpetuation of abuse, and revolution that's taking place in allied industries. Miriam will talk to that with regard to the dance world. So, without further ado, I'd like to invite Molly Quinn just to talk to her experience. Molly is playing Pass the Parcel. Pass the microphone.
I think I've got my own,
You've got one, lovely.
Hello everyone, it's so nice to be here and to hear you all speak this week has been so interesting. I'm Molly and I study on the acting course in Glasgow. I'm in my third year, so I'm just about to graduate. And my introduction to intimacy coordination is different to what I imagine it will be in the future because of COVID. So for the first 2 years, we basically were not allowed to touch each other. So a lot of it was just talking. So initially, an intimacy coordinator was brought into the class. And the process was just spoken through very generally. Questions were answered. We were given the opportunity to ask ourselves questions around personal boundaries and our own levels of comfort around IC work. We had quite a few of these sessions, so we got quite familiar with the work. So after the restrictions were lifted, we had a workshop exploring touch with an existing lecturer, seeing how the quality of movement alone affects the story, that often scenes may not need to be as explicit as you first think. As students, we were asked to question if intimate scenes were always necessary or serve a narrative. This made me feel like we were empowering ourselves as artists and collaborators and not just bodies in the room to be used at the director's disposal. This knowledge was then put into practice when we worked on an adaptation of Faustus. One scene in particular involved the sacrifice and torture of a character. Although this scene was not sexually explicit, an intimacy coordinator was brought into the rehearsal process to facilitate this, as it did deal with trauma. Before being introduced, I really hadn't realised that intimacy coordination was such a new concept. My educational environment, this consent conversation is to be expected. This expectation is also held by my classmates. This didn't seem like a radical idea or a jump, but a natural progression. There is a vulnerability when both joining the industry but drama school itself. Some join this intense environment as young as 18, and when you come, you're just so excited to be there and so grateful to be let in the door that you want to do, not prove yourself, but I suppose prove yourself in a way, but just really throw yourself into any opportunity you can get. And I think that the intimacy coordination, the way it's brought in, just gives you time to really question your own boundaries and discover them. And as someone who's graduating soon and entering the industry, I would always expect explicit scenes to have an intimacy coordinator on them, and I would hope that I would not have to ask for this, that this would be standard practice. Yeah, and the widespread knowledge of what acceptable professional behaviour looks like helps me to feel in communion with and supported by a larger community of actors, film and theatre makers with prioritising the value of respect. Thank you.
Thank you, Molly. I just want to pick up two wee points there. In fact, when we were able to go back to performance, we were still in the land of COVID and social distancing was still very much the thing. So we were creating plays where the actors were 2 meters minimum away from each other. And it was really interesting how creative we had to be with that. We did a play called Bad Roads, which was a piece of verbatim theatre written by a Ukrainian journalist about Russia's invasion into Crimea, a sort of, you know, ironically zeitgeist piece, and before Russia invaded Ukraine. And there was an expectation that just because the actors weren't touching each other, icy was not necessary, and it absolutely was, because the piece was fundamentally about what happens to sex in war and the violence of sex in war and the fact that it becomes weaponized. So just to pick up from that, I'm going to talk a little bit about resistance, because we still have actors making a lot of fuss about IC. So Sean Bean, last summer when I began writing the paper that will be published later on, very high-profile actor that you may know if you've ever come across Game of Thrones. He plays Ned Stark in that series. Was going on about how intimacy coordination was a form of censorship and denied creativity. And his comments were almost identical to that of another actor called Andy Serkis, who again you might know as he was the voice of Gollum in the Lord of the Rings films. Both highly regarded in the industry, both highly garlanded in terms of awards, and they were joined by yet another voice a month ago, Sir Ian Kellen, one of our sort of great British actors, who, and I quote, claimed intimacy coordinators got in the way and ruined the purity of theatre. Okay. Now, there's an obvious question here, which is, you know, is resistance an issue of gender and generational experience? And I might have said yes, except that last week, Toni Collette, again, highly regarded Australian actor who began her career in a film called Muriel's Wedding, those of us of a certain generation may remember that film, came out to talk about the fact that she'd asked for the IC to be removed off set, as they were making her feel anxious. So it's clearly not just an issue of gender and generation. What it is, though, because these actors are of power and have clout in the industry, it's about hierarchy and it is about the power. And intimacy coordination is extraordinarily important because it's there to advocate and protect those who do not have power in the industry. And for me, that's one of the really big plus points of the whole thing. I'm going to ask Miriam to speak now because she's going to talk to intimacy coordination for the dance world. And this is quite new in the edition. Miriam.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Yeah, okay, great. Hello, my name is Miriam Elise Shengun. I'm here today to talk about the way intimacy coordination is beginning to be embraced by the dance world. I began dancing at the age of 4. I won a scholarship to the Dance School Scotland at the age of 11. And then I studied at the Modern Ballet course at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland. Being a dancer requires a lot of strength physically, mentally, and emotionally. This all starts from an incredibly young age. As ballet dancers, we have to wear very tight clothing for the aesthetic of the lines and shapes we create, which ultimately results in our bodies being exposed. Touch is an important part of the learning of the technique, particularly for the safety of pas de deux, which is usually male-female partnering, and is always taught by male teachers who need to ensure the lifts are positioned correctly. During my training, I was lucky enough to be taught by predominantly female teachers. I did have a few male teachers, but not once did I bat an eyelid to question whether or not being in touch was an absolute necessity. Ballet is an art form rooted in centuries of traditional teaching and extremely hierarchical in its structures. The world is familiar with the stories of abuse in the film industry, but it wasn't just the film industry world calling out people. The international ballet world has also been rocked by a series of high-profile scandals in recent years. Some of these include major ballet companies and schools, such as Boston Ballet and New York City Ballet in America, and in the United Kingdom, English National Ballet and Ballet West, where the abuse was so profound that the entire school and company were shut down. It is deeply ingrained in the dance world to say yes and not to say no. If you speak out about anything that you're uncomfortable with, you fear that you will be looked at in a different light and that it will be deemed difficult to work with. However, the advent of IC means that dancers' voices are now being heard within the companies. Dance is an extremely expressive art form. Unlike actors and singers, we don't use our voice to tell stories, we use our bodies and facial expressions. The dance world is now recognising that for certain productions, it is a necessity to include ICs on the creative team to ensure that companies' safety. As part of their 2021-22 season, Scottish Ballet, Scotland's national dance company, performed The Scandal at Marling, based on the true story of Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria, known for his extreme sexual appetites and violence. Scottish Ballet brought on ICs for the first time due to the nature of the narrative, which included rape and scenes set in a brothel. I was curious to know how this innovation had been received, and for the purpose of this presentation, I spoke to newly promoted first artist Harvey Littlefield on his experience working alongside the ICs. I asked him the question, how do you feel about intimacy coordinators coming to work on productions? He answered, I feel that is an important part of training to keep the dancers safe, especially with hard-hitting ballets that involve a lot of touch and sexual acts and/or acting. The idea for ICs is not to change the choreography as such, but to make sure that the dancers speak to each other about consent and boundaries, and if they're comfortable with doing certain moves. We as dancers want to respect the choreography and choreographers, but doing so have the ability to take these skills and make it a safe environment to do so. I then asked Harvey, do you feel that having intimacy coordination workshops whilst training in vocational dance skills would be beneficial? He answered, I think it's more important for IC to start at a young age, because then those dancers will have those tools when they're moving away from home where unacceptable things may happen, and they know how to deal with the situation. Even though I believe it should start from a young age, it's still beneficial to have workshops on IC, even if you're in your first year of a company or your 10th year. It's important for the dancers to learn about, not only the dancers, but the ballet masters, ballet directors, and anyone in the environment of the company, because it's not just the people who are physical that can abuse their power. I am now hoping to train as an IC with the aim of using my dance background to promote a better understanding of this work in the early years of dance training. Harvey is right, and I agree wholeheartedly that the best way to prevent abuse in the dance world is to open up the culture of ballet and create a shared understanding and vocabulary that allows dancers to feel safe. Thank you.
Thanks, Miriam.
Thanks.
So I'm very briefly going to wrap this up because I'm well aware that I'm being glared at from the front row here by my colleagues, quite rightly. It is heartening to see that IC is beginning to roll out into other performance arts, not just acting. And that it is now an expectation in British drama schools that ICs will be there for productions that require it, and that it's being embedded into the training of actors and related artists. What else is there to say? 3 days ago, there was an announcement from Mountview Theatre School in London, who are in partnership with the University of East Anglia, under the guidance of Ita O'Brien, and it's the first degree in intimacy coordination that is being set up in the UK. So it goes from strength to strength, and I am delighted that the voices in support of intimacy coordination are growing louder. Thank you.
Thank Thank you very much. Dziękujemy bardzo. I teraz na scenę zapraszamy.
Okay, thank you very much. And now let's have Adriana Malecka, who's an alumni of this school. She's written a thesis on intimacy coordination, as well as agility.
Intymność w pracy aktora na etapie wchodzenia do zawodu, perspektywa praktyczna.
And the title of the presentation is Intimacy in an Actor's Work when the actor enter the profession, the practical perspective. Good afternoon.
I speak in Polish because it's very intimacy and this is my language. Działa. Okay. Szanowni Państwo, dzień dobry. Pozwolę sobie na wstępie przedstawić.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Allow me to introduce myself just to explain where I'm coming from at this conference. My name is Adriana Malecka and I'm an actress, an actor, or at least finally I can call myself that. I'm also a graduate of the Theatre Academy in Warsaw. I also completed a year's course at the private acting school, and I also completed a 3-month preparatory course at the LART studio in Kraków. I studied 1 year at the acting department of the Łódź Film School. For many years, I've been involved in amateur theatre and film projects before enrolling in drama school. I'm also a witness of change because everywhere I gained experience, I witnessed abuse. Sometimes I was a bystander, sometimes I was a victim. I know many stories that I will never tell anyone because there is no room for those stories because the persons concerned will not be allowed to speak or won't have the courage to do so. All I can do today is describe my own personal example. I was always a dreamer. I always dreamed of being an actress and did everything to become an actress. I was hazed. I underwent the hazing that was mentioned a number of times here. Actually, I was hazed twice in 2 different schools. Don't get me started. I would have a lot to say. I can name and list various types of abuse that I was subjected to. Some of them were even described in the report. I was expelled from school. I went through selection. After the first year, for no progress, and with the annotation, not a promising actor or doesn't bode well as an actress. I was bullied when I was chasing my dreams, and I never saw it as anything bad. I saw it rather as a lesson that the masters wanted to teach me. I still bow whenever I see the Dean of Studies. I was bullied verbally at work, and I treated that as a compliment, or at least tried to do so. I heard that I had the best body in my year, that I was the most feminine, but I had the wrong voice. My physical and mental boundaries were crossed, were violated, and I didn't respond. Sometimes I still don't respond out of fear, sometimes because I'm paralyzed by trauma, sometimes because it could hurt my career and my dreams. For many years, my efforts, my desire to become an actor, because we're all called children, we're called students, so we're referred to as children, not referred to as actors, so I still have a problem calling myself an actor. Over all these years, I met many people who, like me, dreamt of working in this profession and were ready to do a lot to join the industry. This determination, this resolve, this ambition can lead you upwards, but it can also drag you down gradually. The worst thing is when somebody exploits that, when they have us fight at any cost, whatever the cost, and not, without giving us the tools, support, without allowing us to learn from our mistakes, demanding or requiring that we be tough because that's a prerequisite. Well, yes and no. Yes, I do have the impression that what I went through gave me more resilience, but I lost my vigilance. As regards abuse, and this is something I still need to learn anew. I cried my eyes out, trying to understand what happened to me, but the reason was somebody hurt me, because somebody abused the power they had over me, because somebody didn't do their homework, somebody didn't grow as a teacher, because somebody didn't give them the tools, because somebody else didn't teach that person, because somebody else went through the same thing and didn't gripe, didn't complain, and I couldn't object. Fortunately, I was able to be part of a process of change. I can learn a new language, a new school, and break the vicious circle that I had been in. My year gave up, stopped hazing. Instead, it introduced a new tradition of welcoming younger students, which meant a lot of conversations with older colleagues. My colleagues were called cowards who didn't want to stand up to the president of the university, of the academy, along with my peers and Weronika Szczawińska, who was online with us. We were in Klub Ben, a production that was part of Change Now. We did it because after years of hearing how tough it is for women in the profession, because there are no parts for us to play, and we just have to deal with it, we took matters in our own hands and found people who wanted to help us. Yes, discrimination in this business, not only gender discrimination, still exists, but we were able to change something fundamental in a theater school that trains actors, giving them the tools to change the world. This meant various types of criticism. Teachers at the school told us how unhappy they were with the changes we were trying to introduce and how we were undermining years of tradition. I wrote a master's thesis on intimacy coordination from an actor's perspective. I did so because I worked with nudity in student etudes, or when I decided to be an actress as a 7-year-old, I knew that this was something that I would have to deal with because it's part of the profession, and I didn't think about my boundaries, my safety. Thanks to Change Now, I attended a workshop on intimacy coordinator with Vanessa Coffey, and I was enlightened. It opened my eyes. I knew a lot of things by experience. At the workshop, I realized that the knowledge, the know-how is out there, it's abroad, it's making its way into Poland, but young people aren't being given the tools that would allow us to work safely on scenes of that nature. Sometimes film school students aren't aware, don't know what an intimacy coordinator is. So for those who didn't attend workshops, who don't begin in a Netflix production, but acting in student films, exam pieces in schools, or private theater projects, or in the countryside, in the province, where no intimacy coordinators are present, nor is there any money. I know that this was a long introduction, but everything I said is necessary to understand the complexity, how difficult it is for actors working with intimate content, because as young actors, we have the ambition, we have the resolve, and there's also the pressure we feel that there's thousands of people waiting to take our place. So mindless, heedless of our boundaries, we need support, we need tools, we need conversation, because we won't cope with the pressure that's often self-produced, as it was in my case. Especially when our position in the profession is still unclear, which is still frail. And this is, as is the case, I'm one of these people. My last, I worked for a student production where I played Rita, a girl who wants an orgasm, who wants... we had 6 days of shooting, and every day there was an intimate scene. On the first day, there was a shot where I was faking orgasm. I was taking a shower, nude, twice. I had sex doggy style with a partner I didn't know, whom I met 10 minutes before shooting. The second day, I was losing my virginity. There was a younger colleague who was my partner. On day 3, we were having sex in a flower shop. On day 4, I was kissing 3 people at a time at a party. The 4 of us were licking each other's tongues, touching tongues. On day 5, I undressed entirely, facing a 70-year-old male actor who was fully dressed. Then I lay down in bed beside him. On day 6, a month after the shoot, there was another take of the flower shop sex scene with another actor. I know this sounds like a porn flick, but it was just a 20-minute student etude. Lack of a professional genital guard or patch on the first day, incompetent wardrobe supervisor who wanted to take my bathrobe earlier than necessary, no protection, nothing separating myself from my partner, not knowing my partner before, filming the intimate scenes last on a given day, and there was pressure. I needed to go out, leave at a certain time, so it was all a rush job. We were rushed, the change of shots and cinematography. I was being touched by crew members, too many people on set. All of this could have been avoided, just as it could have for other actors and actresses, and other trauma could have been prevented if only we'd known about how to work on scenes of intimacy. For the purposes of this presentation, I did a survey on working with intimate content by actors under 35. So I decided that this would be a good cutoff line. And I had 106 interviewees, 3 of whom were over 35, so I factored them out. Out of 103 actors whom I asked if they ever were in an intimate scene, 91.3, 94 respondents said they did, said they had participated in an intimate scene. And 1 in 2 of these, for them, that was a debut when working on an exam project or a student project. So that was their first time shooting an intimate scene or acting in an intimate scene was in an exam. 19% who took part, who acted an intimate scene, have negative memories, bad or very bad. So 1 in 5. 38% say it was so-so, moderate. None of these people worked with an intimacy coordinator. Only 5 out of the people asked had the benefit of an intimacy coordinator. This was for a TV series or a feature film. And they recall it well or very well. One person said it was so-so. For 39%, this was the only encounter with an intimate content in their work so far. Then I went on to ask people who had acted in more than one intimate scene. Mainly, this was in the theater. That accounts for 63%. In the theater, in student etudes, 56%, and in exam or diploma pieces. Working with intimate content with intimacy coordinators was something that only 17%, 10 of the people I asked, said they experienced. Most of them say it was a good experience. Some said that it was very good. The one person who said it was bad added, we spent 15 minutes talking about a kiss, but before a striptease, stripping down before the entire crew and lots of extras, asking whether only the necessary people could remain on set. My question was ignored, and none of my needs were even taken into account. Another person wrote, I didn't work with an intimacy coordinator. The director decided that a coordinator would get in the way. This was several months ago, and I believe they made a mistake. They were wrong to do so. The opinion that coordinators will get in the way is coming up in private discussions with my peers. These are actors and stage and film directors. Some people are also spreading rumors about, for instance, pheromones that are given by ICs to turn on actors. No, I don't know. Not aware of that. Where does that come from? I don't know. Maybe there's a fear of change. But maybe this new profession that's only just emerging has people with a different experience and know-how who sometimes differ, who don't agree, or who don't know the rules of this profession and don't want to learn the rules. They start off by wanting to change the rules if they have the budget to do so. No wonder courses cost a lot of money and there's a huge demand for ICs. It's different with actors. Very often, first they need ins before they work as professionals. They learn to work with the camera in student films. They do a lot of projects on spec to work on their portfolio, because if they have headshots or whatever, then they might be noticed and hired. They take anything that comes up. Sometimes they read the script, sometimes they don't. They can't count on support from coordinators in intimate scenes because there's not enough coordinators and there's not enough money. Last week on Facebook, one of the many groups for filmmakers in Poland, there was an ad looking for intimacy coordinator for my film. If you are one or know one, then let me know. This was posted by a first-year student at a private Warsaw film school. Every student of cinematography and directing has to do an erotic film, an etude that lasts several minutes and is intended to be sensual. They can choose how to do this, but otherwise they won't get a credit if they don't. The school doesn't provide funds or coordination. There's no rules, no procedure, but it's still a requirement. I saw the ad. I said, I'm not a professional coordinator, but I know a bit and I can help them free of charge. It's a student project, so you work for free. I prepared based on what I learned when writing my master's thesis. None of the crew had worked on an intimate scene before. Only a few persons heard about ICs. This is what I could do to make them feel comfortable. I spoke to the performers before the shot began. I convinced the director to organize a meeting with the actors so they got to know each other before the scene was shot. I wrote check-ins, a nudity rider, and the closet set protocols containing descriptions of what would be done before the shoot, on the day of the shoot, before the screens, nudity, after the wrap. and I consulted them with the actors and the directors. After their approval, I asked all cast members and crew members to read and sign off on these documents. On set, I kept it a closed set, so restricting the number of people present on set and the number of takes that the actress agreed to do. A close-up of her breast, 3 takes, other takes, 5 takes. I was responsible for modesty garments, for genital guards, and for covering her with a bathrobe between shots. I looked after her mental and physical comfort on set, and I was available for other crew members. After the shoot, I got feedback from the performers and participants asking how they feel. And all that, as well as other examples, how to deal with intimate scenes, intimacy, when you can't afford an IC. So I've described that in my thesis, which I can present in my book, which I can roll out today. The book is available as a free ebook. It's especially parts 2 and 3. Okay, you can skip the first part, but it's a set of tools, concepts, and tips on how to work with intimacy as an actor, which can be useful to everybody working with intimacy on set. And I want to thank everybody who contributed: Kasia Renes, Monika Przespolewska, the school, Bernadetta from my year, who designed the cover, the editor, the layout, and my thesis supervisor, Agata Adamiecka, and Dorota Semenowicz. Here's the QR code. If you want to download it, then feel free.
Dziękujemy bardzo Adrianie Maleckiej.
Thank you very much to Adriana. We will now hear from Małgorzata Jabłońska, who will talk about another project being implemented at the school right now. And then we'll move on to the final part of this panel. So I won't tell you anything new or groundbreaking, but hopefully I'll be able to lay out the intimate stage that the school is at and provide some background for it. Dr. Katarzyna Waligura's presentation and the discussion to follow. So, I'll get started. The project Safe Space, Good Practices and Tools to Transform the Polish Theatre System received financing from the Minister of Education and Science in 2022, allowing us to implement it. And so we are currently completing the first year of this project. 3 things happened that made this project possible. First of all, Change Now, and the involvement of the Theatre Academy in that project. Secondly, the sociological research and the report that came out on consent that we talked about yesterday, which contained recommendations regarding how to better work on intimate scenes at the school. The third thing was the ethics group of the Polish Theatre Studies Society, established at the end of 2020, following the wave of call-outs in Poland at the time, including Anna Paliga's letter and that whole story, or Marianna Sadowska's open letter about the violations at the Gardzienica Center, because her letter actually actually called on theater scholars to take accountability. That's why this ethics group was created, and that's where I met Agata Damińska-Sitek, who was the head of that project. And that is also where the Safe Space project team was assembled. Agata's project consists of Małgorzata Jabłońska, Izabela Zawadzka, Dr. Katarzyna Waligura. So that's the research part. Then we have organizational support from Beata Szczucińska and Katarzyna Renes, as well as other wonderful ladies. We also have expert support in IC from Kaja Wesołek-Podziemska and Marta Zygadła. So that's our team. The project is very practical, so we're less interested in research and more interested in making our knowledge available to whoever needs it. So these are our assumptions and goals. The project itself involves 4 main tasks and 4 main outcomes that we want to achieve. So I think my counting is off a little, but there are 4. So first of all, it's analyzing and implementing the conclusions and recommendations from the non- or unconsent report. Within that part of the project, we are working in a team that brings together students from Warsaw and Białystok, the faculty, the university authorities, as well as the students' rights and employee rights ombudspeople. And within that group, we are trying to come up with the best way to implement the recommendations of the report and implement other things that follow from other components of our project. The main part of the goal is to organize intimacy coordination workshops for acting students and puppet students in Warsaw and Białystok, directors, students studying directing in Warsaw and Białystok, as well as all the teaching staff in those 2 cities. So for each of these groups, we did a pilot workshop. Then we collected feedback from the attendees in order to adapt those workshops for the needs of each specific group. So in that manner, for instance, the workshops for teaching staff addressed the need mentioned in the report. So this sense of isolation or loneliness some faculty felt. That's why we're also trying to provide support and give them skills to work with. So we're focusing on communication with students, offering new tools where the old tools have failed. The workshops are run by Kaja and Marta. For the students, the aim of the workshop was to introduce them to the basics of intimacy coordination. What does it mean to have an IC on set in theater or in film, laying out the basics, so working based on conscious consent, on informed consent, working under a contract, and what students can demand if there's no IC. There are also de-rolling techniques and that provide additional protection. Of course, we are also continually evaluating everything we do. So the next stage after the workshops is to come up with 2 academic courses. These are all working titles. So one will be called Intimacy in the Creative Process, this will be addressed to students of directing and acting and theater ethics. This course will be designed for theater studies majors. So we are developing the program of these courses, a list of issues to be addressed, plus the reading list, or the readings, which will be rolled together into a book and published. We also want to publish a Polish translation of the important book on intimacy coordination. And based on those experiences, we'll also be running workshops for the open theater community in 3 theaters, in Warsaw, Szczecin, and Gorzów, as well as at Choria in Łódź. So they will be on working with intimacy, feedback, nonviolent communication, and contract development. And those workshops will be run by Kaja, Anna Zabrodzka, Małgorzata Wdowik, and Ula Kijak. So, and at the end of it all, we will come up with a report. We have currently trained all the students. Challenges still remain. We've trained all the acting students. We've trained all the staff. One of the challenges that appeared had to do with training directors, directing students, because they have more specific needs. So this is something we're still developing. What this experience shows are the pluses and minuses of translating IC knowledge from the English context into the Polish context. This gives rise to many questions, and Dr. Waligura will discuss those issues in her paper, presenting the opportunities we see in that regard, as well as various IC models which could be implemented in the Polish theater system.
Nie działa, tak? Nie, on bardzo chce popełnić samobójstwo i spaść ze stołu. Tak. Dziękuję bardzo. Tak jak wspomniała Gosia...
Like Małgorzata said, I wanted to present the starting point for our discussion that we'll be having in a moment, and we'll be inviting more people to join us on stage. The discussion is about how intimacy coordination. The first question is how we want to call this profession. I'll stick with IC, because out of convenience and custom, because there's really no good Polish equivalent at the moment. We haven't really, but the forms of working with intimacy in Polish theater, and as we see it, as I see it, this ought to be expanded, especially in terms of the job description, the competences and the powers of such a person. My presentation is the product. When we began working on this safe space project, when we began thinking about the Polish theater system and the way the rules we were taught and we read about, rules or ideas taken from the Anglo-American environment, how they would translate into a Polish context, we had a lot of doubts, so we had a lot of questions. We're also following the way practice of IC and working with intimacy is being absorbed in Polish theater. The models I'll be presenting are speculative, and I realize that there are many limitations, many restrictions that hinder the implementation of these models. I realize that I'm talking about something that's a question for the future, but thinking about even utopian thinking. But future-mindedness is something we need if we are to introduce change today, and if we are to plot out this change, the direction of the change. So IC is something that's only making its way into Polish theater. And the best way of testing, of fact-finding, would be to talk to the persons involved, stage directors, theater directors, actors, and intimacy coordinators themselves. I've learned a lot, we're learning a lot from Kaja and Marta, and I also talked it over in our project group. Małgorzata Jabłońska mentioned this group, and especially Izabela Zawadzka, with whom we developed these models. I'm not naming everybody I spoke to because I don't want you to identify what I'm about to say with their positions, their ideas. I will be writing an article where I'll provide a more detailed commentary on what I was told. My interlocutors had their own ideas of what IC should be, how to introduce it. Sometimes they disagreed with various things. So generally, it's a very complex picture. Anything I'm about to say is the product of dialogue, and it inspired me. But it's not. I'm not falling back on verbatim on what I was told. So these four models, I think that we have to define what intimacy means in theater practice. And I think we need to expand when working with IC. So intimacy can't simply be erotic or simulated sex, kissing, nudity. We need to reconsider it, and we need to expand it to cover processes, theater processes, which involve working with the body, intense working with the body and with emotions in a non-sexual context, because this is also high risk, this is also very charged. The models aren't mutually exclusive. I'd even go so far as to say that they can be implemented in parallel, and in a way it's being done already, so concurrently. So the first model would be disseminating knowledge. We share knowledge about this field, this profession, between all interested parties, and this is something we're witnessing now with training courses and workshops at the Theatre Academy and another Polish drama schools. And obviously, if we were to be serious, we would also need to train people who work in theaters, because there will be a generation shift, and people trained in theater school will start work in theater, but they will be working with people who haven't gone through this training. The advantage is that this is a process that can be put into effect easily. It's going on at the moment. So boundaries, setting boundaries, the boundaries of your partner on stage. This is something that is necessary, that should be discussed. Disadvantage is that we don't have any outside perspective, and it also restricts the knowledge we have. What I'm saying is that this model looks at certain aspects of the creative process, but it doesn't factor in all the elements in which it can be a challenge for the stakeholders, for the participants. The second model would be training choreographers. In Poland, as in the US, we're witnessing that choreographers are interested, dancers are interested in intimacy coordination. One example is Kaja Kołodziejczyk in Poland and Krystyna Szydłowska-Lama. In a handbook, Staging Sex, Chelsea Peace writes that handing over intimacy to dancers, choreographers, is an old approach that we ought to be moving away from. But it's not handing over to choreographers, but rather to people who have knowledge, have know-how in choreography, who are trained in working with intimacy and who have more skills. One advantage is that choreographers start off with a lot of knowledge about working with the body and choreographing block intimacy, so they start off with that advantage. The the disadvantage, is that it gives choreographers extra work, question whether they'll be paid for that, and it's also an extra burden, it's an extra requirement to attend courses, which can be expensive. For instance, IC courses at the moment in the West can be prohibitively or can be expensive. So the question is, who covers the cost and what are the benefits for the trainee? The attendee. The risk I see in Polish theater, choreographers are judged on their performance, so they're part of the creative process, just as we judge the director based on their work, so do we judge the choreographer. And the risk, as I see it, is that it'll be focused too much on effect, on outcome, rather than on the process, at least in some cases. At least for some people who are considering the profession, which is not to say that every choreographer will be right, will be a good fit, and the market might force people into training even though they're not qualified, they don't have what it takes to be an IC. The third model is hiring specialists on a project basis. And this is a model that we had in the Immoral Tales, directed by Jakub Skrzywanek at Warsaw's Teatr Powszechny. And working with intimacy, and as well as all other processes that are charged in some way, which need to be supervised by a specialist who doesn't necessarily have to be an IC. This can also be, for instance, sometimes you might need a psychologist, a counselor, a sexologist, or like a specialist in martial arts, or what have you, a coach. This would allow us to take into account the needs of actors and directors, depending on the nature of the process. So in this model, there are two important questions to ask. First of all, who selects the person, the advisor, who chooses them? And the second is, what are the rules? Will this person be along for the entire process, or will they be brought in only for the scenes? Will they be remunerated by from the project's budget, or will they be hired by the theater? The advantage is that you can tailor, you can find someone, you can customize, you can find specialists in a given field, and it gives specialists more flexibility. They can move from project to project because full-time employment isn't really profitable. In the theater, you don't make a lot of money, but the risk is that the coordinator or specialist will be dependent on the stage director. So if you have choreographers, for instance, who work full-time or semi-full-time with stage directors, and there might be some sort of pressure to make the specialist, the IC, also part of a director's entourage, right? And some sort of close cooperation. And there might be some safeguards here. For instance, limit the number of projects a team, a tandem can do together. This might also be an advantage. People who've worked together, who know each other, ironically, or actually they can make the process safer. It's difficult to gauge. at this time, at least. And of course, there's the question about funding, because if these specialists were to be employed and if their fees, their wages were to be paid by the institution, then there's a smaller slice of the pie and everybody will go hungry. And the fourth model, and a model that I personally am closest to, this is something I've evolved into. This is a model whereby specialists are consent specialists. We have full-time consent specialists, so not employing coordinators, intimacy coordinators, but consent specialists. A separate position, which would be like a dramaturg or a music director. So this would be somebody on call who would respond to the needs of the employees. So you could, this could be a choreographer trained to work with intimacy. At the moment, choreographers are also demanding or asking to be given a place, a job, a full-time job in theater, so they could be choreographer as well as consultants or intimacy consultants or consent consultants, especially knowing the way Polish theaters operate their HR policy or their staffing policy. So this should be a jack of all trades, in a way. This should be somebody who teaches informed consent. This should be somebody who helps out in charged and fraught scenes. And of course, this wouldn't just be limited to actors and directors, but also technicians. Some technicians might want to attend courses or training. These would be people who would have oversight over the creative process, but they could also call in other people, people with different skill sets, or people who can communicate well, who play well with a given director, because sometimes a specialist, a coordinator, really isn't right for a process, and you also need to respect the voluntary nature, so you need to avoid some sort of coercion, and so you want to look for somebody who can stand in if, for example, somebody's overworked. And the person should tell people about the rules and regulations, the ground rules, and also do risk assessment for creative processes, some sort of risk assessment at the start, so you can predict the degree of risk associated with a given process, so what you ought to be aware of in advance. And this could be also someone who provides on-the-spot consultation, topical consultation as needed for employees, counseling. And again, the job description can be negotiated in the institution, but it could also be somebody who takes in any complaints about bullying or harassment. So this could be generally somebody whose job it is to ensure a culture of consent for also anti-racism, anti-homophobic, and so on, and anti-discriminatory. And I'm also thinking of two other tasks. They could be they could mediate between, for instance, the promotion department, so that the no promotional photographs, especially with nudity, are publicly available, and also controlling the hygiene of whenever elements of a set or whatever, or if a naked body or if actors are required to crawl on stage, this person could be in charge of ensuring that the stage is clean and sanitized. So the advantage here is that it's very comprehensive. It's a very comprehensive model, and this person would be available, would be there in the theater, would be part of the institution, so you wouldn't have to worry about going over budget. But again, it's expensive because a full-time post, and you'd need to you'd need to create another full-time post, and also that person could be involved in some sort of collusion, or if there's a theater where the actors are a strong collective, where their position is powerful, then where they have leverage, this coordinator might be drawn into these power plays or games or whatever.